Welcome to the 2 to 20 podcast, where we empower women how to build, fund, and scale their businesses. I'm Katie Vander Ark, and we're joined today with Caroline Cherkassky, a partner at Orrick Law Firm here in Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Katie.
So you have quickly become one of my favorite people in LA. We met last year during Tech Week. You were kind enough to come on as one of the first sponsors of one of the very first events that I ever threw. And ever since then, I feel like we hit it off. We're like very kindred spirits. We're from the same hometown. And I feel like we just have a lot of common interests. So it's been so fun getting to know you over the last year and a half.
This has been fantastic. I love when like work relationships and ecosystem events turn into real friendships, which is why we can play tennis. And the fact that we're from the same hometown is just a wild coincidence.
Yes, yes. Shout out to Federal Way, Washington. I know that you're a partner at Orrick now, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got there and what inspired you to go into kind of the early stage tech forum for law.
For sure. So I'm a partner at Orrick. We're an international law firm, full service. Among other things, one of our big verticals is working with startup and venture capital. So that includes super early stage companies all the way until that hopeful big exit, along with regulatory benefits and commercial transactions that go along with the governance of the company. So this is part of what we call big law, the big international law firms. I actually started my career up in Silicon Valley at other big law firms. I did not come out of law school to be a startup lawyer. I thought I would do different kind of deals. And I got stuck on one transaction early on, and I was totally hooked because working with founders, early stage companies, you get to add a lot of value really quickly. When you are a junior lawyer on a giant transaction, you're working on amazing things, but you're also like checking checklists all the time, as opposed to meeting with the companies, going to board meetings as junior associate. So very much got hooked early on, and that was the end of it for me. I was all in on startups and venture capital from then on.
Yeah. And how have you felt about your transition from Silicon Valley down to Los Angeles? Because I know that's, you were kind of at like the hub of it all. So I feel like I obviously love the LA market. How do you feel about working in the LA market?
Totally long LA. I came down to LA 11 years ago now, and for a variety of reasons, never intended to stay. It was meant to be a temporary move. So I actually spent a couple of years bouncing back and forth to Silicon Valley. But it was just a really great time to be down here. The Silicon Beach scene was booming, really exciting. And so I fell in love with both the ecosystem for the tech work, and also just frankly being down here by the beach was really fun. And I've never looked back. Very much love being down here. I mean, I still go to Silicon Valley frequently. There's no denying, as I'm sure you have encountered, just that that's where a lot of the money is. But there's a lot more happening in LA. The funds are growing. There's more access, and it's very exciting to be down here.
Yeah, I heard the stat at an event last week that we have over 120 venture funds based here in Los Angeles.
I love that.
Which when I was going to undergrad here, I that was far from the case. So even in just since I graduated, there's been like this massive boom in the space. So I also agree it's been fun to be down here and be able to build a tech company in Los Angeles and live by the beach.
Yeah, and I mean, talent is not, you still have a lot of that up in the Bay Area, but with remote work and support from companies and investors, people being around the country, you just have a lot more flexibility to still build companies from LA or from places that aren't Silicon Valley, frankly.
Yeah. My company is totally distributed. We're in 6 or 7 different cities. So, I mean, we're headquartered here technically, but what does that really mean when everybody lives all over and you service clients everywhere too? So
Exactly.
yeah. One of the fun things, especially because you're so good at, like I look to you for a lot of advice. You are not my lawyer, but you've been very kind to be a sounding board for me. And one of the things I know that you're really wonderful at too is advice for early stage founders. And one of the things I kind of wanted to go over with you is sort of like startup legal 101 and a lot of kind of quick questions. So I thought we might go through like a lightning round of questions or thoughts that you might have around certain topics. And then, so, if you have any hot button thoughts around them, it would be good to know.
I love lightning round. Fantastic.
So one of the first questions I feel like people ask when they're starting a company is around founder equity and splits. And so I wonder, I feel like the YC, the Y Combinator kind of school of thought is 50-50. But I also know a lot of folks that don't follow that. And it might also be dependent on how long were the founders, were they there from the very beginning? Are they technical or not? Are they bringing capital? So I feel like it's a little bit different now. So I was wondering if you had thoughts around founder equity split.
Absolutely. It's difficult to change later. So my main thought is think about it a lot at the beginning and make sure both parties, both or all, if you have more than two, are comfortable with it, because that persists for a long time absent some top up later. 50-50 is a good answer in some cases, but it's not always the answer. So giving a close, hard look at is someone doing it full time and someone's doing it part time? Did someone do it for 2 years before the other person joined later? Like, those kinds of questions are important to ask and inform the split.
Yeah. Okay. Related to that is sort of around co-founder splits. So it happens from time to time. You start a company, maybe somebody is not a right fit. Maybe, somebody wants to go back to having a full-time job. All sorts of things happen with founders. What are your thoughts around, is there anything that we as founders could be thinking about in terms of clauses or ways to protect ourselves, or anything around like how to handle co-founder splits?
Yeah, the main things are to get your documentation in order ahead of time when everyone is best of friends, before things could possibly go non-amicably. Get that paperwork locked up then, so you don't have to discuss it and argue over it later when tensions are high.
Yeah.
So it's much easier to have a calm conversation around, hey, do we want our equity to vest? So vesting means you don't keep everything you start out with unless you've been there for a certain amount of time. A common time frame is 4 years. If you leave after 2, half your stock goes back. So things like that can protect emotions also in relationships. Think of it kind of like a prenup, right? Yeah. So you just sort of have that discussion and hash it out ahead of time, so that when if things do get separated, that you've sort of pre-discussed and don't have to have that conversation later.
Yeah, being brutally honest up front. I liked something that I looked into too was around like the 4-year vest, 1-year cliff, but also having partial, some of it related to getting a product off the ground or certain milestones as well, which I thought was like good, especially if you have like a technical partner. So there's sort of different ways to have incentives around that, which I like too, outside of just time vesting.
You can do milestone vesting too.
Yeah, I like the combo. Sometimes it just depends probably how you both feel about it, but I like being brutally honest before signing any documentation, which is good.
Very much agree.
Yeah. And the next topic is around intellectual property, IP rights. Maybe two-prong on this one, which is just one, how do you think about it? How do you take care of it at the very beginning? And then especially if you are dealing with outsourced developers. So I know a lot of folks outsource their development team before bringing on a full-time team, on later rounds. So maybe the first part is intellectual property, just how do we go about protecting our IP?
Yeah, so the first part is a great question and really foundational. Anytime we do Startup 101, footfalls to avoid IP protection is like high up there. And when we talk about IP protection, it's not just hard IP like patent filings and trademarks, but also just conceptual development. So making sure that people who are working together and people who are working on the business have signed agreements that assign, like i.e. transfer, like what they work on to the business. That way the company owns the work that's been done. That can look like a contractor agreement. That can look like an invention assignment agreement for an employee. It can take different names, but the structure is really similar. It basically says what I work on is owned by the company.
Yeah. The second part of that too is, I assume, related, like even if you have somebody that does early UX UI, like a prototype design, and developers, you probably want to have them both be signing contracts that say any work that I do is assigned to the company and I have no ownership over the designs, right?
Yeah, anyone doing work for the company should sign something like that. Now, and there should be consideration also. It doesn't have to be huge, like payment for it. Now, whether that's a cash payment, whether, so those details should be hashed out in the contract, but you should pay something for the IP, but make sure it's documented that the company owns it. What you don't want to have happen is, hey, we didn't document that. 3 years later, you go into diligence when an investor or an acquirer is looking into your files and they say, hey, what about this party? Why do they only have an NDA that just covers confidentiality? Why don't they have an agreement that covers ownership? And then you have to go back and figure out how to plug that hole, which is always harder after the fact.
Yeah. Everything's harder down the road than it is at the beginning.
Yeah.
Next question is around state of registration and I guess also type of registration. So why do most companies have Delaware C Corps?
Great question. When most of the businesses have traditionally been in California, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but it is Delaware. There's a long, robust body of corporate law and jurisprudence in Delaware that just gives everyone a lot of familiarity and comfort with how governance will run. So when venture capital investors invest into a company, they know that here's a structure under Delaware. We sort of know how things operate, how different relationships among shareholders and boards will go down, and what those rules are, and how we play through the life cycle of the company. So, for historical reasons, we're mostly in Delaware and mostly corporations. So, if you're venture backed or seeking to be venture backed, Delaware C Corp is the way to go.
Yeah. Would you consider it a red flag if you are not a Delaware C Corp and you're going into raising capital most of the time?
I wouldn't say not a red flag in terms of run away, but a red flag, a yellow flag in terms of expect to have to change that. There are some exceptions, right? But most of the time you'll see a Delaware C Corp now, whether that means, let's say you're a California corporation, sometimes those will persist for a while. The corporate structure is really important. A lot of venture capitalists cannot invest into LLC structures. But California Corp versus Delaware Corp is more about governance. And so sometimes you can see people get comfortable with a California corporation.
Yeah. Okay. Next is around, I guess kind of some of the earlier questions around like equity splits, but around your thoughts around equity incentives for early employees. So some people use that pretty heavily. Other people I've talked to are really like just being cash dependent at the beginning, not handing out much equity, reserving most of the equity for a lot of the co-founders. So I wonder what your thoughts are around, especially when you're like a pre-seed stage company, how you think about equity incentives for employees.
For sure. Equity can be a really great tool, especially for an employee that you expect to be working for a long time. Where I see it more problematically is if you're using it for like one-off projects, right? Oh, we don't have cash. Let's pay this one-time project person in equity. It's problematic for a variety of reasons, but also equity is a very long-term relationship, right?
Yeah.
Yes, you have a cliff that will hopefully, in most cases, hopefully when you grant the equity, you put a cliff in place. But let's say that person's there for a couple of years. That's a long-term there. They could be an equity holder for the lifetime of the company, right? So you want to be careful when you're handing it out that you feel like this is for a relationship that will stick. But it also creates a great incentive, right? You have these people who feel like they're owners in the business, which when you're early on is really important for creating that motivation. But just be careful. I see a lot of founders, when you're pre-seed, you haven't taken a lot of dilution yet. So it might feel like handing out small percentages is a small percentage, but then modeling out what that looks like, whether it's through an Excel model or some of the online tools, or a friend who likes to work with those, or your lawyer, right?
Yeah.
Modeling out future scenarios to understand, hey, if I give out 0.5% here and 2% there and 0.25 here, like what does that look like down the next round, and how does that impact my ownership also, and sort of the breakdown of the company?
Yeah. I did all three. So my lawyer provided me with a cap table in Excel. I use Carta, but also Pole. They all have tools to be able to model out, which is great. So before you even offer anything, you can model out all of your entire round and your dilution and all sorts of great tools, which is super great for founders.
Yeah, those are excellent tools that weren't on the market when I first started doing this. if it
Yeah,
changes.
I know. It's been really game changing for me because I feel like it makes everything simpler for as a founder. They also Carta another thing. They have another around employee compensation too. So you can do modeling around. I want to offer this much salary, this much equity. They live in this market. They're this senior or junior, and that's been really helpful too around thinking about how to offer packages to folks.
Right. 'Cause, you might be competing for talent, right? So what is the market going to expect for this kind of position?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The next one was around safes versus convertible notes. So I think a lot of times it's pretty commonly known that you would just use a safe for a pre-seed round, but when do you start using convertible notes? And maybe also just like clarify too why you might be using a safe for a pre-seed versus actually having a price round for a
Mhm.
seed stage round.
For sure. The main reason is it's cheaper and faster,
Yeah.
right? So convertible or safe, convertible note or safe, I'll lump them in with convertibles for a moment. Just much cheaper and faster to execute on than a priced round, where you're
Yeah.
usually going through, the volume documentation might be 10x paperwork, right?
Yeah.
You're getting an actual stockholder, then they're voting, maybe there's board rights, you might be going through, depending on who the investor is, more rigorous diligence, right? So the process is just longer and more expensive, which at the pre-seed stage, when you can do it through a well-trodden path like a safe or a note, is almost a no-brainer in a lot of cases. I mean, as to why a safe over a convertible note, the safe came about to basically address the idea that people were using convertible notes, but no one really wanted to get paid back in most cases, like in the venture space. People weren't investing in notes with the goal of getting their interest back in a couple of years at maturity. The goal was always to flip into equity.
Mhm.
And these maturity dates, there was an interest rate which matters more or less to certain investors, but the maturity date, sometimes it would come and we just extend it because everyone still wanted to get into the company. They didn't actually want their money back in a lot of cases. So a safe is much more company friendly. There is no ticking clock for maturity.
Right.
Now there are some investors who choose to do a convertible note instead of a safe because it does frankly provide more protection to the investors, right? If there's you can do a secured convertible note, give them a security interest, which provides the investor more protection in the event the company has a liquidation, for instance. So there are pros and cons for each side, but for the company side, it's typically more favorable and faster just to do a safe.
Yeah. Okay. I like that. I mean, and it's super simple. Y Combinator has, and a bunch of other folks now have templates online, which is great. I used my lawyer for mine, but there's luckily for the first kind of, if you're bringing on like friends and family money for the first few checks in, it's a pretty simple way to be able to use a safe and be able to close some early capital, which is pretty easy when you're first getting off the
Yeah,
ground. Not
it's
easy,
meant to be
less complicated.
it's meant to be plug and play, right? Like the YC forms have a clause in them that says basically this has not been modified. Everyone using it represents this has not been modified from the form. Now, obviously, if you make modifications, you take that out, right? But it's helpful for people who are using it to say, oh, this is what I know. This is what this includes, and it can take away a lot of friction, right,
Yeah.
with the investment.
Yeah. One of the questions I had too was around I've had a few founders who have opted to try to not use a lawyer at first. They go online, they create whatever forms. So I know some folks who even started working on a product with somebody without having any sort of documentation. Um, and I often caution everybody against that. You would think I work for a law firm, how much I recommend that everybody talks to a lawyer. But kind of to your early point around like it's sort of like a prenup, but it just makes everything also very clear and concise around how and why we are working on things. One of the questions I had was, when do you know when it's time to speak to a lawyer? And then eventually, when do you know it's time to, like, if you're working with a smaller independent lawyer, when do you know that it's time to maybe move up to a maybe slightly larger firm that has more support? So is it later rounds? Is it the amount of capital that you're raising? Is it the complexity of the round? So sort of like, again, when should you seek a lawyer? And then when should you maybe kind of size up in terms of your legal representation?
I love these questions. I have a lot of thoughts. And the answer isn't like you should always use a big firm
No.
from day one, right? The answer is a little more nuanced. The answer is it depends a lot on thinking first about when should you use a lawyer. I often tell people if you're founding a company and it's just you working on something individually, you might not need a lawyer or even a company yet. You can work confidently on your own to get that where you want it to be. If you're not, if you're not engaging with business with third parties, you're sort of still ideating, right? Once you are contracting with third parties, you want a business, you want an entity. Once you have a co-founder or an employee or some sort of third party, you want an entity and you want an agreement to make sure those things are locked up, because you can't easily lock them up while you don't have the business formed. And for that, you usually want a lawyer, right? That will say, hey, this agreement says what you think it says, and it's going to govern your relationship. And not only does it say what you think it says, but, and this gets to your question about when should you like graduate from small to large, that definitely varies from company to company. But what you always want is a lawyer who works in this space, right? So whether that's a big firm lawyer or a boutique firm lawyer or a small lawyer who has experience in those areas, is someone who operates with startups and venture capital firms and sort of knows how to work with those tried and true documents and can set you up in a way that looks very familiar to investors down the road, right? So the type of advisory agreement you have, the type of co-founder documents you have in place, the type of invention assignment agreements you have in place, there are forms and sort of tried and true ways to approach those that are familiar to everyone in the space. So as long as you have someone who knows that, the answer can be a little bit fluid. Now, as you graduate and raise more money and you get into regulatory areas or you get into priced round territory, at that point, you usually do want like more hefty legal support.
Yeah, makes total sense. I started working with a smaller firm, but they were very specialized in venture-backed companies, IP law, startup contracts, partner negotiation. So they were very specific in the practice. Now I am getting into more complicated like real estate law, and that's like slightly outside of their scope. So I felt like that was like a good example of I could start small and specialized, and then when things kind of grow outside of that, that felt like the to your examples of like it was probably time to graduate from that, but or in addition to. So
yeah, you can also mix and match.
Yeah, for different purposes.
And we see that a lot in different, sometimes businesses that are heavily regulated might have needs that are very specific and very, you need to go somewhere big early on, right? Versus a business that's not regulated may not have as many needs in that space.
Yeah, yeah. One of my next questions was around for lawyers that are either just getting into law school, maybe they're working on their summer internship, maybe they're about to graduate, whatever they may be doing, and they're thinking about what practice area that they want to go into. What are your thoughts around or recommendations for folks thinking about wanting to go into the tech practice?
I would say look for anything. So if you're in law school, try and take classes at the business school also. Very helpful, especially if they have anything startup or venture focused. It's really helpful to understand not just the legal side of that, but a lot of what we work on as lawyers is actually business advising, because we see so many deals that we can say, okay, here's what we're seeing with this governance term. It's not strictly a question of, it's not a question of case law or your traditional law school exam question. It's more a question of what are we seeing in the market? How are these parties treating one another, and what's the relationship there? So getting some context from the business school side, if you can do that, is helpful, or looking at the law school classes that will, take you through term sheets or other sort of practicum style classes.
Is that normal for the business school for them to allow you to take business school courses as well? Does it depend on what school you're at?
Institution, right? I think I was just talking to a law student recently who was able to sort of cross enroll in a couple different classes. So I think it really depends on the institution, but if you can, it's a great opportunity.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. My lawyer that I had been working with since the beginning had full understanding of my entire business, which was so helpful. So he obviously gave legal advice, but he also quite well understood my entire business model. And so when I asked him questions, it was both from a legal and a business standpoint, which was, it felt more like an advisor instead of just my lawyer, which is, as an early stage founder or first time founder, is like such a relief to have somebody that like can speak both languages.
Yeah, I think it's one of the big perks of being in this. I mean, for people who like it, like myself, being in this type of law, you're doing the law, but you're also doing the business side a little bit. Obviously, we're not running the business. We understand what our clients are doing typically, and we'll think more about advisory side issues as opposed to just pure how does the law get applied.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Well, I super appreciate you being on the podcast with me and doing like our lightning rounds. We'll probably have to have you back for like a round 2 of all the different questions that might come up. But those were kind of some of the early submitted questions around sort of startup 101 legal and what do we need to know. They're all super helpful. One of the other things that I love too is that we do a lot of events together. So I don't know if you want to talk at all about any of the stuff that Orrick does for the community, but I know like next week we're doing events for Tech Week. We're doing one for female founders and funders. But I also know that Orrick does a lot of stuff around the community. So I don't know if you want to get into how anybody else could plug into kind of your network here in LA.
For sure. Well, obviously you can find me on LinkedIn or on the Orrick site. Yes, and that's how we met, like you said, right? We were co-sponsoring an event. I can't believe was that just last year? That feels like longer ago.
I know. I know.
I feel like I've known you for much longer. So I personally am a big supporter of doing female-focused events, which is why I love doing these panels or these lunches or breakfasts we have, bringing together both the female founders and also people from the female VC community. Yeah. So that's really, really fun and a personal passion of mine. We try and do those. I wouldn't say it's a regular cadence, it's more strategically, right? Just sprinkling them throughout the year. But of course, Orrick, both in LA and also throughout the country and the world, frankly, we'll put on different, we'll have AI panels or privacy panels or Startup 101. I do a lot of Startup 101 events. So those things are frequently occurring at different areas in the country, and always love to see new faces.
Awesome. Okay, well, good. Well, I can't wait to see you in person next week, and maybe we'll bring you back for Startup 101 round 2 in the near future.
Amazing. This was such a pleasure. Thanks, Katie.
Okay, thank you.